All right, before moving on from chapter 9 onto chapter 10, I thought I'd do a couple of problems for you from the end of the chapter 9 in the text. I'm going to start with problem 17, and get the camera on there. And so problem 17 says, consider the market for pop rocks depicted in the diagram below. And you've got a diagram that looks like this. Quantity. And in this case, the marginal cost is constant at 0.1. This is marginal cost. And the demand curve starts at 1. And what you're told is that it hits the axis at 100. Okay. And so we'll go through the problem. Part A asks, if this industry were competitive, this is the demand curve. If this industry were competitive, what would the competitive price and quantity be? Well, if it were competitive, marginal cost would be 0.1. And if we're competitive, we would call that the supply curve for the industry. And so price and quantity would both be set here. Marginal cost would equal marginal revenue. And we would expect this to be the equilibrium quantity, and the price would be 0.1. So the price is 10 cents. And what's the equilibrium quantity? Well, from looking at this graph, we can see that the inverse demand has an intercept of 1. And as it goes down 1, it increases by 100. That tells us that the slope is 0.01. And so that's the inverse demand curve. So if we set price equal to 0.1 and solve for the quantity, we'll get 0.01 Q is equal to 0.9, or Q, that's a 9, or Q then is equal to 90. And so this would be the competitive price and quantity. Part B asks, if this were a competitive industry, what would be the consumer and producer surpluses? So part B, consumer surplus is going to be the area under the demand curve out to 90 units. And so that's a height of, well, it's going to be a triangle. So the area is going to be 1/2 the height, 0.9, times the base, which is 90. And that comes out to be 40.5. The producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, above the marginal cost curve in this case, and below the price. And you can see that there is no area there. So there is no producer surplus in this case. All the surplus is consumer surplus. Part C, suppose the gangland figure Tommy Vercetti monopolizes the pop rock market. What price and quantity would he choose to maximize profit? So part C says, suppose this were a monopoly. If this were a monopoly, then we'd need to find the marginal revenue. And that marginal revenue would have the same intercept as the demand curve, but it would be twice as steep. So marginal revenue would be 1 minus 0.02 Q. And now to find the equilibrium quantity, we set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So 0.01 equals 1 minus 0.02 Q, marginal cost and marginal revenue. Solve for the quantity. So now we get, 0.02 Q equals sorry, that should be 0.1, not 0.01. 0.1 equals 0.9. And now solve for the quantity, and the quantity turns out to be 45. So that's the equilibrium quantity. The equilibrium price then we find by going up to the demand curve. And so the inverse demand is price equals 1 minus 0.01 Q. So 1 minus 0.01 times 45 is 1 minus 0.45 or 0.55. And so that's the price for this monopoly. Price is 55 cents. Oh, sorry. Calculate the consumer and producer surpluses for the monopoly. That's part D. So for part D, the consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand curve and above 55 cents. And so that's going to be that triangle, 1/2 of 0.45 times the base of 45. And that comes out to be 10.125. Okay, that's this area here. The producer surplus is going to be the area, move the camera just a little bit here, get more on the page. The producer surplus is going to be the area above the marginal cost curve, below that price, out to equilibrium quantity. So the producer surplus is just going to be this rectangle, which has a height of 0.45 and a width of 45. And so that's going to be 20.25. Okay. And part E asks you to compare your answers to B and D, and asks how big is the deadweight loss of this monopoly? Well, the sum of producer and consumer surplus under monopoly is 30.375. Okay. And that tells us that compared with the consumer surplus, the combined consumer and producer surplus under competition of 40.5, it tells us that the deadweight loss from monopoly is the difference between the consumer surplus under competition, which we know is socially optimal, and the consumer surplus under monopoly. So that's 40.5 minus 30.375, which is 10.125. Alternatively, we could find the deadweight loss in our picture. This triangle here was initially part of consumer surplus and is now neither part of consumer surplus nor producer surplus. So this triangle is deadweight loss. And that triangle then is 1/2. The height is 0.45 and the width is 45. And that then is 10.125. We get the same answer either way, either by looking at this triangle or by subtracting the sum of consumer and producer surplus under monopoly from the consumer surplus, or the sum of consumer and producer surplus under competition. So that's problem 17. The second problem I want to do is problem 20. 20 says, consider a small isolated town in which a brewery faces the following inverse demand. So this is question 20. And there's a, try to get a focus here. Not sure why it doesn't focus all the time. All right, we'll go. The inverse demand is price equals 15 minus 0.33 Q. There we go. And the brewery can produce beer at a constant marginal and average cost of $1 per bottle. So marginal cost equals average total cost equals 1. First thing it asks you to do is to calculate the profit maximizing price and quantity, as well as the producer and consumer surplus and the deadweight loss. All right, so let's draw a picture of this. The inverse demand curve has an intercept of 15 and a negative slope. So it looks something like that. And the marginal revenue is going to have the same slope, the same intercept, and it's going to be twice as steep. So that's marginal revenue. And then marginal cost is going to be $1 at all times. So that's marginal cost. And this asks you to find the profit maximizing price and quantity. So the profit maximizing quantity is going to be right here. We're going to set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. Marginal cost is 1. Marginal revenue is 15 minus 0.66 Q. Okay. And so 0.66 Q equals 14. Q then is equal to 21.21. That's what this is. 21.21 is the quantity at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue. To find the profit maximizing price for this monopoly, we'll go back to the demand curve and we'll stick this quantity in. So the price is going to be 15 minus 0.33 times 21.21. And that will turn out to be just about 8. Go around a little bit, but that comes out to 8. Okay. And it asks for producer and consumer surplus and deadweight loss. So the producer surplus is this triangle here. And that is going to be 1/2, the consumer surplus is 1/2 of the height is 7 and the base is 21.21. That comes out to 74.24. The producer surplus is this rectangle here. And that's going to have a height of 7 times 21.21. That will come out to 148.48. And this is the deadweight loss. Height of 7. We need to figure out what that quantity is. So if we set the demand equal to 1, equal to marginal cost, so price is 15 minus 0.33 Q, and marginal cost is always equal to 1. So we'll set those equal to each other. 1 equals 15 minus 0.33 Q. So 0.33 Q equals 14. Q comes out to be 42.42. That's what this is. And so the deadweight loss is 7 times 21.21, the base, times 1/2, and that is 74.24. Okay, so that's all part A. Part B asks, if it were possible to organize the townsfolk, how much would they be willing to pay the brewery to sell beer at a price equal to its marginal cost? Well, let's think about this. If the brewer were willing to lower its price to $1, sales would increase to 42.42, and this entire area would become consumer surplus. So the added consumer surplus would be equal to what is now producer surplus plus what is now the deadweight loss. So that's 148.48 plus 74.24. And that comes out to, get my calculator and we'll figure that out. 148.48 plus 74.24. That's 222.72. That's how much they would be willing to pay, because that's how much consumers would benefit from being able to buy the beer at a price of $1. And so this is the consumer's willingness to pay, because that's what they would stand to gain. They pay up to that. Part C asks, what is the minimum payment the brewery would be willing to accept to sell beer at a price equal to marginal cost? Well, what was the brewery give up? The brewery would have to give up this producer surplus if it were to lower the price, and that's it. And so the lost producer surplus from selling at a price of $1 is this area, $148.48 or 48 cents. Okay, and that's the compensation required to get the firm to lower the price to $1. Part D asks, is there potentially a bargain that can be struck between the townsfolk and the brewery? And the answer is, it seems like it. Townsfolk are willing to pay $222, and the brewery needs to be paid $148. So somewhere between those two amounts is going to be a figure that satisfies both parties. And what would happen is, as the price came down along that demand curve, consumers would buy more. And so suppose they agreed on some price in between $8 and $1, somewhere in between the maximum willingness to pay and the minimum compensation required. If they were at a place like that, then this would be the remaining deadweight loss. And so the last part of the question is, what would happen to the deadweight loss if such a bargain were struck? And you can see that the deadweight loss would get smaller and smaller. In the limit, if they push the price all the way to $1, there would be no deadweight loss. But for any price less than $8, the deadweight loss gets smaller and smaller. And that's problem 20. I will include these with the pages from the chapter, and let me know if you have questions about these. Thanks.